Good day. Today is Sunday, 8th February 2026. And before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. If once you've watched this program or whatever part of the program you want to watch, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Well, to start this program again, I'm going to return once more to the topic of the attempted assassination of General Alexeyev, of Russian military intelligence, the number 2 of Russia's chief negotiator in the Abu Dhabi talks, Admiral Kostyukov, and someone who, according to reports and rumors in the Russian media and in Russian social media, was actually a representative, one of the Russian negotiators himself in the negotiations in Abu Dhabi. Well, this morning we've had further news that Alexeyev is out of danger. He's apparently conscious, and the expectations are that he will achieve, well, a recovery. Let's not say a full recovery, but he's conscious and he is alive. So the assassination attempt that was made on him appears to have failed. But much more interesting, at least for a channel like this, is the fact that the FSB, the Russian counterintelligence and counter-terrorism agency, has successfully caught the person who they say, and who Russia's investigative commission, the law enforcement agency, in overall charge of investigations of these cases. Anyway, the person who these two agencies say almost certainly was the gunman who shot and wounded Alexeyev and who sought to kill him. And we've had information about this man, and he apparently, his name, it seems, is Leu Bomir KBA. We're told that he is a Russian citizen, but that he was born in Ternopil region of Ukraine. He is apparently 60 years old, and he apparently came to Moscow in December with instructions from the Ukrainian authorities to carry out some kind of action in Russia, in Moscow. And allegedly there is film, I haven't seen it, which shows the gunman leaving the scene, trying to conceal a pistol. We're told it was a Soviet issue Makarov pistol with a silencer in the area near the apartment building where the attempted killing took place. And KBA then fled and went presumably straight to one of Moscow's airports and flew out of Moscow to Dubai, to the United Arab Emirates. The Russian authorities very quickly tracked his movements. They contacted the authorities in the UAE. The authorities in the UAE quickly arrested KBA. There seems to have been some kind of contacts between Moscow and the UAE. President Putin of Russia has just thanked the president of the UAE, President Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, for the assistance that the UAE rendered to Russia in capturing and arresting KBA. And the Russians have released film of a business jet arriving in Moscow from the UAE, and we see FSB agents in balaclavas removing a man who they say is KBA from the plane, though the face itself is blurred. And the Russians also have provided further details of the people who they say were involved in this attempted assassination. And these include an individual called Viktor Yasin, who apparently once served in the Navy, the Russian Navy, and who is a former signals officer. He apparently studied at the School of the Signals in Kemerovo. He's now apparently involved in occupational health and safety and transportation security services, whatever that means. He's apparently been closely involved with Korba. The two men exchanged money and had other long-standing contacts with each other. Anyway, it seems that he too has also been arrested. Vasin has also been arrested, and he's also been charged. He's apparently been publicly critical of the Russian government, and there are reports that he's also been taking out loans, and who knows, there might have been financial problems involved. And lastly, and perhaps most interestingly, there was a third accomplice, a woman by the name of Zinaida Serebritskaya, a Russian name, and according to the Russian authorities, she was living in the same apartment building. She had a flat in the same apartment building as the apartment building where Alexeyev lived, and she has disappeared and is now believed to be in Ukraine. Now, all of these people, all of these names, Vasin, Korba, this person, this woman, Zinaida Serebritskaya, they all seem to be the sort of people you would expect to be involved in an assassination attempt carried out by Ukraine. Now, it's important to say that these are all so far suspects. Putin, for example, former lawyer that he is, in his telephone conversation with the president of the UAE, was careful to refer to Korba as a suspect. He's not yet been convicted. But I have to say that the accumulation of evidence makes it to me extremely unlikely that these people were not involved in the assassination attempt on Alexeyev. I would be astonished if they were not involved. And I have to say also that given their backgrounds and the detail of the information that has been provided by them, it seems to me clear that these were indeed people acting as Ukrainian agents. Vasin and Korba almost certainly full-time agents of the Ukrainian Special Services, presumably the SBU. The woman, Serebritskaya, probably also. She seems to have been there to keep an eye on Alexeyev's movements and presumably to inform Korba about where he was. As I said, it looks to me like a carefully planned and carefully prepared assassination carried out by a trio of agents working for Ukraine's special services. Now, I mention all of this, and I've gone into all of this detail because yesterday, as I discussed in my program, there was vehement denials from Ukraine that they had any involvement in this killing, or at least I should say attempted killing at all. There were the stories that were being spread that this was all the result of internecine quarrels between Russian security agencies, lots of things of that kind. I have to say that I never believed any of these claims, as I said in my program yesterday, and looking at the information the Russian authorities have produced today, provided us with today, it seems to me that it's impossible any longer to give any further credence to these claims. So there it is, an assassination attempt carried out by Ukraine's special services against the number two of Russia's chief negotiator at the Abu Dhabi talks, and someone who, by the way, the victim, probably one of the negotiators himself. There's been much outcry and anger about this in Russia. Some of the channels that I read, and I understand some of the television and radio stations, which have, if you like, a more patriotic nationalist perspective of things, are furious about this. They're asking, why do the Russians continue to respond to all of this with kid gloves? They say, why isn't it time for the gloves to come off? Why are Ukrainians allowed to carry out these sort of operations in Moscow? Why do the Russians not respond by carrying out in Kiev and in other Ukrainian cities operations of the same kind? And there continue to be calls for Russia to reconsider its participation in the negotiations in Abu Dhabi. Now, I've noticed some very desperate attempts, I consider them desperate, in the West to try to justify this attempted assassination. Mark Galeotti, who certainly is someone who is very well informed about Russian affairs, though he seems to have a very, very anti-Putin perspective at the moment. He didn't always, by the way. Anyway, Mark Galeotti has said that Alexeyev, because of his background and because of his position as a serving officer in Russian military intelligence, was a legitimate target for Ukraine. I'm not sure I would agree with that under any context, actually. Bear in mind that technically, even as of now, Russia and Ukraine are not at war. But let's put that aside. If Alexeyev was a negotiator, if he was part of the Russian negotiating team meeting with the Ukrainians in Abu Dhabi, then absolutely he would not be a legitimate target. It is a well-established principle going back millennia that if you are involved in negotiations to end a war, you do not go out and try to assassinate the other side's negotiators. This is a fundamental, very well-known principle. It was even recognized as such in the ancient world. So he would not have been a legitimate target if he was one of Russia's negotiating team. I want to stress again, I don't know for a fact that he was. I think it is quite possible that he was, but I don't know for certainty that he was, just saying. But even if he wasn't, putting aside whether in terms of the laws of war he was a legitimate target or not, it is an incredible, astonishing thing to do, to conduct an assassination attempt on the chief deputy of the man who you are negotiating with and meeting across the table in Abu Dhabi. Now, I said in one of my recent programs that it didn't seem to me likely that this assassination was first planned and greenlit as a result of the meetings in Abu Dhabi. And the Russian authorities say that Kulba came to Moscow in order to fulfill his mission back in December. They don't say which time exactly in December. And, well, that, it seems to me, is a logical timeline, working out exactly Alexeyev's schedule and movements, having some idea of where he would be at any one particular point in time, planning the killing properly. Well, that would have taken time, and I would guess 2 months is about the amount of time it would need. So I absolutely do think that Cordoba was sent to Moscow in December with the intention of assassinating Alexeyev then, and the authorization, the Russian agreement, the agreement that Putin gave to authorize the negotiations, was made following the Putin's own meeting with Witkoff and Kushner in Moscow at the end of December. And I think, if I have to say it, I think that probably the assassination, the intention to agree to decide this assassination must have predated it. But of course, you can plan, and you can give an order to do something in December. But if the situation changes, such as, for example, would have been the case if you began negotiations with the Russians, you can, of course, always rescind the order before the order itself is carried out. The SBU and Zelensky and the other officials in Kiev presumably would have had means to provide instructions to the assassination team in Moscow. They could have told them to call it off. They could have said, look, we're meeting with the Russians now. We have these negotiations going on in Abu Dhabi. The Americans won't be happy if we do this. We are trying to find a way forward in Abu Dhabi with the Russians. The Russians will be furious with us if we either assassinate one of Russia's negotiators, or try to assassinate the chief lieutenant of Russia's negotiators. So we gave you the order to kill Alexeyev before, but we are telling you now, don't do it. Well, it's clear that no such decision to rescind the order was ever made. So Zelensky, over the last, and I have no doubt, by the way, that he was involved, he's made no secret at all of his support, indeed encouragement, indeed incitement of these sort of activities on Russian territory. Anyway, Zelensky and his various officials, people like Poklad in the SBU, went ahead with this despite the fact that the negotiations in Abu Dhabi were ongoing. As far as I am concerned, it can't get worse than this. Even if Alexeyev was not present in Abu Dhabi, this is an extraordinary, incredible thing to do as the two sides are sitting down and negotiating with each other. Anyway, I am going to add a few further points before I leave this topic. Firstly, Korba was, according to the Russians, sent to Moscow in December. December was also the time when the drones were launched against Novgorod from the territory of Ukraine, heading, as the Russians claim, towards Putin's country residence on Lake Valdai. I've already discussed that particular episode extensively. I've spoken about how important it is, or was, for the Russians, and how it has soured the atmosphere, and how the Russians have informed the Americans, about which, by the way, I don't think there's any doubt, that the episode, the attack on Valdai, would make them harden their negotiating stance. Now, I have discussed the Russian hardening of their negotiating stance in several programs now. in my very last program, after a statement made by the Russian Foreign Ministry, I speculated that possibly, the way the Russians were hardening their stance was by making it clear that they do not want Vladimir Zelensky or any of his officials to be in power or in control of Ukraine any longer once a peace is achieved. So that was one speculation. Previously, I had speculated that maybe, based on certain comments that Putin himself made in a speech he gave to foreign ambassadors, maybe the Russians intended to demand that peace in Ukraine be linked to a renegotiation of the security architecture in Europe. Gordon Hahn, who has a different view about this whole business from me, accepts that there is a possibility that the Russians may be in the process of hardening their negotiating stance, though I should say he, from what I can see, still has entirely legitimate doubts about this. I think he's still not as convinced about this as I am. He has also said, however, in his latest post in discussions about this matter, that if the Russians are indeed in the process of hardening their stance, as I understand it, he thinks it is more likely that the Russians are going to harden their stance relative to the question of security, the security architecture in Europe, rather than insisting on regime change in Kiev. Well, as I said, I don't know. I am not in touch with the Russian negotiators, so they haven't explained their negotiations position or tactics with me. But I wonder whether perhaps the best thing to do is for Gordon and myself, perhaps on the Duran, to have a public discussion, not a debate, because we agree on most things, a discussion about this, and maybe see whether we can work towards some kind of consensus as to what exactly is going on. Anyway, I just float that possibility. I've not done it in any other place. Anyway, let's move on. So it does seem to me that one way or the other, we did start to see a descent into further recklessness on the side of the Ukrainians in December. The drone attack on Novgorod, which I have no doubt the Russians are right, it was an attempt to attack the Valdai residence and, if possible, kill Putin himself. Zelensky, after all, on Christmas Day, spoke about how the whole population of Ukraine longs to see one individual perish. It's not difficult to work out that he was talking about Putin. And, well, we see that at the same time, the Ukrainians were also planning operations of this kind in Moscow. Despite the fact that meetings in Abu Dhabi then began, they went ahead with the operation in Moscow, despite the Russian warnings and complaints about the attack on Valdai. Now, the latest word from Moscow is that they do not intend to call off the talks because the talks serve a second purpose separate from the one of negotiating with Ukraine, which is that they enable the Russians to develop their contacts with the Americans. As I discussed again in a recent program, the Russian and American militaries have agreed to resume their dialogue, which had previously been stopped by the Biden administration. And for what it's worth, in my opinion, very little, Kirill Dmitriev and Steve Witkoff still sit together and talk about grandiose economic plans, which, by the way, even if there is peace in Ukraine, I am absolutely certain will never materialize. But anyway, those contacts do exist. And from a Russian point of view, it's better to have those contacts than not. So despite that, despite what has happened, the sense I get across, from the way the elite, the Moscow elite, are talking or are discussing this, is that it's perhaps better for the moment to stick with Abu Dhabi and the talks there and to see whether this process can lead to a further development of an upgrade of contacts between Moscow and Washington. That is too important to be derailed by these kind of operations carried out by Zelensky himself. And that, by the way, is not inconsistent with an extraordinarily tough-minded, almost ruthless way in which the Russians conduct these sort of things. But about Ukraine, about Zelensky, inevitably the feelings in Moscow are going to harden further. And firstly, I should say that I think it is wrong that the Russians take no counter steps against Ukrainian intelligence and security officers who are behind these kind of operations. Back in the autumn, I remember that a senior Ukrainian SBU official, who was widely believed to be behind many of the assassinations and other dirty war operations in Russia, was assassinated in Kiev. And of course, also late last year, the Ukrainian politician Andrei Parubi, very much a hardliner, very much somebody on the nationalist side of the Ukrainian political spectrum, former commandant in Maidan Square at the time of the protests in 2013 and 2014, which eventually led to the violent overthrow of President Yanukovych. Anyway, Andrei Parubi was also assassinated, and though the Ukrainian authorities have not so far, or have not been able to connect his assassin to the Russian security agencies, they say that they believe that he was connected in some way, and for all I know, he might have been. So I'm not convinced that the Russians are, in fact, sitting on their hands and doing nothing. They've also, to my knowledge, made several attempts to eliminate Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's chief of military intelligence, who is now Zelensky's chief of staff and who is undoubtedly a participant in the talks in Abu Dhabi. But whatever, I firmly expect that the Russians are going to be coming after more people, including perhaps Poklad himself, at some point over the next few weeks and months. It is difficult for outsiders, I think, to understand quite what a big event in Russia this attempted assassination was. Alexeyev was one of the Russian generals who I think it is fair to say was better known amongst the Russian public. He's played a fairly prominent role, and he is someone who, as I said, the Russian population, or at least the more informed amongst them, has heard of. So this has been a significant event in Russia. And, well, on that topic, and on the topic of Russian ruthlessness, I would just say that the Kremlin, when asked about the lapses of security around Alexeyev, said, well, it's nothing to do with us. This is the responsibility of Russia's security services. Why don't you ask them? I have to say, I thought that was an extremely chilly comment. I'm not sure how Russians themselves would feel about it, but it does also reflect that ruthless toughness, which is also a characteristic of the way in which this country, Russia, often conducts its affairs. Anyway, let's move on and let's talk about the situation in Ukraine. And it seems to me that over the last 24 hours, even as things get worse and worse, Zelensky's condition also seems to be deteriorating alongside that of his country. Anyway, let's first of all talk about the situation in Ukraine. First of all, my speculations yesterday that electric power from the nuclear power plants has been cut off, it turns out is mostly true. I'm not going to pretend that I have a complete understanding of the technology, because I absolutely don't. And it's undoubtedly the case that electric power is still being generated at some level inside Ukraine. But nonetheless, for the moment, the nuclear power plants, which produce more than half of Ukraine's electricity, are no longer apparently supplying electric power directly to the electricity grid. So this is creating a crisis. It seems also that the substation that was attacked near Lvov is not so much connected to the nuclear power plants, but is critically important in terms of transferring electricity exported to Ukraine from the European Union, principally, I believe, by the way, from Hungary and Slovakia, just saying, to Ukraine. And if this substation has suffered significant damage, well, of course, that will also affect power transmission from the European Union to Ukraine, further aggravating the problems, the energy problems in Ukraine. And, well, the situation in Kiev is very bad. The situation in other Ukrainian cities is, if possible, even worse. There are reports of growing cascade problems. I read that in some places, heating and power is only available for around 1.5 hours a day over a 24-hour period, only 1 to 1.5 hours. I'm not sure where this is the case, which cities this is the case. I get the sense that in Kiev itself, which presumably is to some extent protected, I get the sense that there the situation is still rather better. But overall, the situation is terrible. The weather at the moment is a little warmer in Ukraine, but it seems that the temperatures are about to plunge again, deepening the appalling crisis in which the Ukrainian civilian population, finds itself in. And again, I have been tracking the comments that have been made by on Ukrainian channels by Ukrainian officials, including Energy Minister Shmyhal. And though they're trying to put the best face that they can on this critical situation, I get the sense that they are themselves increasingly close to outright despair. They understand that as soon as they get things up and running again, or at least partially up and running again, the Russians come back, strike them once more, and everything goes back to the way that it was. In fact, it gets worse. And Ukraine's ability to defend itself from these attacks also appears to be lessening. Over the course of the last big strike that took place 2 days ago, 3 days ago, it was noted by several commentators that whilst air defences in Kiev itself still seem to be functioning, at least at some level, elsewhere in Ukraine, air defense has basically completely broken down. Probably there are still air defense units functioning, and maybe they are themselves affected by the power failures. I don't know. I would assume that they have their own generators, but then generators need to be repowered from time to time, and that's a problem. Besides, I suspect that they're now short of missiles again, interceptor missiles, and probably their ability to conduct air defense is diminishing, especially as I am sure that Zelensky and his officials are now transferring whatever air defense interceptors, Patriot missile interceptors, Ukraine still has, to Kiev to provide whatever defense of the capital Ukraine can still muster. Anyway, so the Russians able to operate across Ukraine. Last night it was just, as far as I can tell, mostly a drone strike. But I noticed that Naftogaz, Ukraine's natural gas agency, spoke about natural gas facilities also having been attacked by Russian drones. I'm not sure where these facilities were or what exactly it was that they were doing. But anyway, those attacks continue, and obviously natural gas is what is mostly used in Ukraine to provide heating, and without electricity or gas, the situation in many Ukrainian cities with temperatures falling apparently to -20, it must be absolutely appalling and even unbearable. So this is the situation. Well, Zelensky yesterday admitted that there were problems in the generating system. He spoke about how things were not good and how there's been real problems in energy generation. He said that there's been damage done. But I thought the most extraordinary thing that he said was that he apparently called together a meeting of people from the Ukrainian energy companies, the electricity suppliers, and apparently he stormed at them. He said that they're not acting quickly enough. He said that they must act faster. He apparently, I've seen some descriptions suggesting that it was practically a rant. I've no doubt that these people are doing everything they can and are working as hard as they can, but I cannot see realistically what more that they can do beyond what they are doing already. And one of the things that I noticed is that in the English translation of one of Zelensky's social media messages, social media posts, he talked about how the sort of brigades that are being deployed to try to rectify this damage must do more. Of course, he would have been talking in Ukrainian. Maybe the word must is in English gives a different impression, a different sense of the Ukrainian word. But in my experience, when people in these kind of situations use the word must, in other words, try to impose themselves and to remedy problems through the pure exercise of will, then we can say that the situation is indeed out of control and they are losing their grip and have taken leave of their senses. That's my sense of this. Anyway, Zelensky was saying an awful lot more yesterday, and it was getting more and more excitable, if that's the right word, over the course of the day. He said that the next meeting, there will be another meeting of the Working Party, but the Americans this time have offered to hold the meeting in the United States. The Ukrainians are in agreement with this. They're waiting to see what the Russians will say. For the record on that, if that is a serious proposal, and if it is a proposal that comes from the United States, the Russians might agree, but I think on balance they would definitely prefer to hold the meeting in what they see as neutral territory, which is Abu Dhabi. And I would personally expect the Russians to push back against this idea. I wonder whether it was in fact the Americans who came up with this proposal, or whether maybe it might have come from Zelensky himself. Just saying. Anyway, Zelensky demanded, or already said, that the meeting should happen in the United States rather than in the UAE. But then he said an awful lot more. He said that, again, that Ukraine will not withdraw from Donbass, that if there's going to be a cessation of hostilities, it must be on the existing conflict line. He said that Ukraine is open to the idea of a free trade area being set up in Donbass, a terrible idea, by the way, one which the Americans have floated and which the Russians have rejected. But anyway, Zelensky is harping on about that again. And, well, interestingly, shortly after, the Russians made clear publicly what they have apparently repeatedly told the Americans in private, which is that the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is not open for discussion. As far as the Russians are concerned, it belongs to Russia. It is a Russian nuclear power station, not a Ukrainian one. And following the peace, it must and will remain under Russian control. Apparently, the Russians have made that absolutely crystal clear to the Americans, and it was apparently repeated again by the negotiators in Abu Dhabi. Anyway, Zelensky came along and said it's not a good idea for the Americans to control the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It belongs to Ukraine, and it must be handed over in its entirety to Ukraine. So, even as the Russians have made known their disagreement with this extremely bad American idea, Zelensky, perhaps unwisely, given Trump's interest in the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, has come and trashed the American idea also. And he still seems to talk about ceasefires and energy ceasefires, and he continues to demand sanctions and all of these things. Altogether, as the attacks on the cities have escalated, as more and more of Ukraine plunges into ever deeper darkness, with the worst of this coming after the Christmas New Year holiday, I get the sense with Zelensky of a man who is now practically at the end of his tether. It doesn't mean that he's going to lose control in Kiev. It doesn't mean that he's about to lose power, or that he's close to losing or close to changing his stance on the war or in terms of the negotiations. Rather, getting the sense that he can absolutely see now, not just that the writing is on the wall, but that the walls are starting to close in, and he's now busy basically abusing and insulting everybody, even as he portrays himself as the great victim and the person who's being betrayed. So he stormed at the Europeans in Davos. He insulted them there. He now has criticized, as I discussed in my program yesterday, his air defense people, his air force, because they cannot stop the Russian drones and the Russian missiles striking across Ukraine. He's storming and insulting the people in the energy system, who are no doubt doing everything they possibly can in this impossible situation. And of course, you could argue that his dispatch of assassins to try to murder top Russian officials, and even perhaps in December the president of Russia, also is a sign of his growing desperation as well. Well, we have a fair way to go in this conflict, and I suspect that as things continue to get worse, we will see more examples of Zelensky's increasingly unbalanced and extraordinary behavior over the next few weeks and months. Anyway, Zelensky also said something further. He said, and it's important to stress that this has not come from the Americans, and it's certainly not been confirmed by the Russians. He said that the Americans are in contact, that they want elections to take place in Ukraine in March, and it is they who are indeed putting pressure on the Ukrainians and on the Russians too, to end the war by the summer. I wonder again whether this is more a case of Zelensky feeling the pressure and blaming the Americans, in effect, for the pressure he is under, than of Zelensky reporting the state of the negotiations correctly. I say that because Donald Trump, at least in some of his recent comments, has made clear that he has no deadline. He's not working under any deadline or any timetable in matters relating to Ukrainian peace, achieving peace in Ukraine. As I said, to repeat once more, this entirely comes from Zelensky. It has not been corroborated either by the United States or by Russia. And possibly, just possibly, it is Zelensky also saying all of this because he too wants to try to get a ceasefire as quickly as possible. He's always been seeking a ceasefire. And what he wants is to talk this up in order to get the Americans to think about these impossible deadlines so that they then start to put the pressure on the Russians that he wants them to put on the Russians in order to force the Russians into a ceasefire. For the record, I think the Americans have been trying to force the Russians to agree to a ceasefire for over a year. President Trump continues to insist that India has agreed to stop buying Russian oil. He issued an executive order saying that he was lifting the tariff on India because of India's purchases of Russian oil on the basis of a pledge supposedly given to him by Prime Minister Modi of India that India would not buy Russian oil. And he said that India's decision to stop buying Russian oil would actually make possible peace in Ukraine sooner. So far, there has been no word from India itself that they have stopped buying Russian oil. Indian officials who've commented on this topic have been extraordinarily evasive in their words. Other areas of cooperation between Russia and India continue. I've heard reports that the negotiations, the discussions between India and Russia to start joint production of Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighter jets in India are moving rapidly forward, and it seems that the Russians and the Indians are now in serious discussions with each other about joint plans in the civil aerospace sector. And those are just only some examples. So the Indians at the moment are playing their usual careful game. They're getting the tariffs, it seems to me, reduced. They're allowing Trump to say whatever he wants to say. I think that they probably calculate correctly that at some point Trump is going to lose interest in this topic and is unlikely to lift the tariffs on India again, even if India does continue to buy Russian oil. And for the record, I don't believe that India really has agreed to zero tariffs on American agricultural imports. That would have been such an extraordinary concession that I can't generally believe that it has been made. Perhaps the Indians have said something to that effect, but I don't believe they will really do it. Anyway, so yes, it's true. I think that Trump does want to see an end to the conflict, and maybe Zelensky will come along and say to him, look, we're not moving anywhere. The negotiations are stuck. The Russians are taking their time. You need to put pressure on them. You need a ceasefire. We need a ceasefire. We need to stop the fighting. We need to stop the misery in the cities, all of those things. But the reality is, as I've discussed in many programs, both on this channel and on the Duran, when it comes to the Russians, the United States simply doesn't have that much leverage. It can put pressure on other countries. It can put pressure on Venezuela, on Cuba, on Iran. But Russia, a far bigger, much more powerful country, a great power, is a different matter altogether. So anyway, Zelensky, as I said, is going through a meltdown, as is often the way with such people who are experiencing that kind of process. Probably there will be upward blips when he seems more confident and more in control. But as I said, I suspect that over the next, as events continue to worsen, we're going to see a further deterioration from him. But for the moment, at least, the Russians themselves remain icily silent, both about the negotiations in Abu Dhabi, where, as I have said, there's been little substantive progress on the major issues. No Ukrainian agreement to withdraw from Donbass, outright rejection by the Russians of security guarantees for Ukraine, outright rejection by the Russians of proposals that they hand over the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant either to Ukraine or to a consortium involving Ukraine or to the United States. So, as I said, the Russians remain icily silent, but they continue to pulverize Ukraine from the sky, and they continue to advance on the front lines. Now, I said yesterday that there is considerable movement in Zaporozhye, which there continues to be, by the way. And this morning, there was also further reports of more Russian movements north of Pokrovsk. It does seem as if the town of Belitskaya north of Rodinska, is indeed surrounded and that there is indeed heavy fighting going on inside that important town. And the expectations are, because it's not a particularly big place, that it will fall fairly soon. But perhaps even more interesting is the continued Russian advance in the northern parts of the Donetsk front lines, where east of Slavyansk, where the Russians are now moving actually quite rapidly towards Slavyansk itself and towards the important fortified village of Alexandrovka, which, as I said, is the main Russian objective at the moment in this area. And of course, there's also been more reports about a critical situation for the Ukrainians in Liman. But alongside all of this, the intrigue of what group of forces north is up to in Chernigov, Kharkov, and Sumy regions remains. With every day now, there are more reports of the Russians occupying more Ukrainian villages along the border and extending the areas that they've already controlled in the northern parts of these regions. So the Russian positions in Sumy region, around the village of Yunakovka, for example, they seem to be steadily expanding. The Russians also are steadily and incrementally expanding the territory that they control south and east and west of Volchansk, the town that they recently captured in Kharkiv region. And, well, as I said, they seem to be capturing all sorts of villages along the Ukrainian border. And I get the sense that there are relatively few Ukrainian troops in this region, and that many of these places that the Russians are capturing along the border are being captured undefended. And, well, there's been all sorts of suggestions that the Russians are thickening out their buffer zone. It is indeed the case that Ukraine does continue to carry out attacks on Russian territory, on Bryansk region and on Belgorod region. The days of very deep strikes by Ukrainian drones deep inside Russia seem to have ended, at least for the moment. But attacks across the border by Ukraine upon Russian border cities like Belgorod and Bryansk still continue and still cause damage and injury and power cut-offs and such things. But to be quite honest, I am not sure that it is just a question of creating a buffer zone. It seems to me that what has happened is that with the crisis in Donbass, the military crisis in Donbass, with the situation in Zaporozhye deteriorating, and with Zelensky anxious to prevent any deal whereby the Americans force the Ukrainians to give up Donbass, Zelensky feels obliged to commit whatever forces Ukraine still has to plug the holes in Donbass especially, but to some extent in Zaporozhye too. And that has left the northern territories, Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernigov, mostly undefended, with the result is that relatively small numbers of Russian troops, and as far as I can tell, group of forces north still commands only a relatively small forces compared with other Russian groups of forces fighting elsewhere in the conflict zone, are basically able to walk across the border and capture border villages and do so almost at will. In other words, this is an opportunistic operation by the Russians as the Ukrainians are tied up elsewhere to strengthen Russian positions in the northern regions, as I said already, in my opinion, in advance of a future potential Russian operation against Kiev itself. Anyway, we shall see. Meanwhile, as all of these things play out on the battlefields, as the negotiations go nowhere, as the pulverizing of Ukraine from the sky continues too, we see more talk in the West, in Western Europe, about the need to restart some kind of dialogue with Russia. The latest person to urge this is Prime Minister Babiš of the Czech Republic. Chancellor Merz of Germany sort of ducks around this issue. He said that yes, some kind of dialogue with Russia is probably a good idea, but we mustn't have lots of parallel tracks, and in order we must avoid that at any possible way, which would suggest that, as far as I can tell, he doesn't want the Europeans really to negotiate with the Russians at all. Parallel tracks means presumably that the Europeans conduct their own discussions with the Russians separately from the Americans and the Ukrainians. So he doesn't really want the Europeans to be engaging in talks with the Russians, but he's going through the motions of pretending that he does. President Macron of France, as I discussed, sent his national security advisor to Moscow. There's no word that anything much came of that visit, and there's still no sign of a telephone call between Macron and Putin. And for the record, I think Macron is one of the last people that Putin is anxious to talk to. He's had many conversations with Macron in the past, and my impression of Putin is that he found all of these conversations infuriating, with Macron arrogant and condescending, and with the discussions taking up a huge amount of time, but ultimately leading nowhere. Other leaders in Europe, of course, are more open to talking about the Russians. Prime Minister Orbán of Hungary, who faces a difficult election in a few months, has nonetheless come out and said that Ukraine, because of its constant efforts to cut off the supply of oil and gas to Ukraine, is behaving more like an enemy than a friend. More than an enemy than an adversary, in fact, not a friend at all. So for the moment at least, Orbán is talking to the Russians, but not, as far as I can see, to the Ukrainians. And in Britain, we continue to be in a critical situation following the Epstein-Mandelson scandal. Today, there's been more reports of cabinet ministers briefing the media saying that they believe that this scandal may cause Prime Minister Starmer's resignation. Yesterday, David Lammy, who is the Deputy Prime Minister, came out and said that he'd advised Starmer against appointing Mandelson ambassador to Washington. Angela Rayner, formerly Labour's deputy leader, never deputy prime minister, but deputy leader. Anyway, she's come out and said essentially the same thing, that she too told Starmer not to appoint Mandelson ambassador to Washington. There continue to be desperate attempts in parts of the British media to try to link Epstein to Russia. There's a very bizarre article in Unheard making exactly these kind of claims, though accepting that Epstein probably was not exactly a Russian agent. He was somehow involved in a huge nexus of Russian corruption and kleptocracy. The quality of that article, as far as I am concerned, is exposed firstly by its attempts to revive the Russiagate allegations of Trump's first term, and secondly, by its attempt to assert that a well-known Russian oligarch attended a Russian-American meeting in Riyadh back in March of 2025, when Lavrov and Rubio met, and that supposedly this Russian oligarch was also present, except of course that he wasn't, as we have been repeatedly told, both by him, his people, and by the officials of both sides. And I noticed that this article, in order to lend credence to the claim that this particular Russian oligarch did participate in this meeting, it links to a Chinese website or a Chinese language website in which everything is in Chinese and therefore impossible for anybody who doesn't speak Chinese to understand. Anyway, that's the quality of the media coverage that we're getting here. To repeat again, Epstein was not a Russian agent. The idea is absurd. Amongst Epstein's friends or clients, if you prefer, there was a president of the United States, former president of the United States, Bill Clinton, a former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, a former Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers, all sorts of other very important people. It is inconceivable, if he was a Russian agent, that he wouldn't have been noticed by US counterintelligence, by the FBI and the CIA and all of those people. And, well, as I said already, the whole idea is totally and utterly absurd. But you still see these articles still appearing in the British media, even though they encounter not just disbelief, but derision from the British public. But anyway, we're still absorbed by this scandal. When ministers, for the record, when cabinet ministers are coming out, even anonymously, and are starting to distance themselves from the Prime Minister, and when people like a cabinet minister like David Lammy are doing so publicly, well, in my experience, it is always a clear sign that the Prime Minister is about to fall. So I think that there remains, in fact, I continue to think that there is a very strong chance that Prime Minister Starmer may be forced to resign as early as tomorrow. We shall see. But anyway, whatever. In Britain, we're all completely absorbed by this crisis. Obviously, no real time to send emissaries to speak to the Prince of Darkness, the true Prince of Darkness, Vladimir Putin, in Moscow, or any of his officials. So there's no real movement in London either, from London either. So there's a lot of talk about starting negotiations, opening dialogue with the Russians, but so far, no real action at all. Wolfgang Munchau says in the Daily Telegraph today, he's written a piece in the Daily Telegraph, in which he says that he knows of lots of German and American business people who are booking flights to Moscow. How they're getting there, I'm not sure, but are arriving in Moscow, and that the hotels in Moscow are packed with these people, all extremely anxious to restart business, maybe. And it is also undoubtedly the case that the sports bodies, FIFA, the international, which runs the Soccer World Cup, the International Olympic Committee, all of them, they're now coming out and saying that maybe excluding the Russians from international sport was not such a good idea after all. I've been making that point, by the way, for years. And maybe, just possibly, the moment has come to start lifting the restrictions on them and to start having them back again. This, by the way, even as the Winter Olympics, I believe, are about to start. Well, there's an awful lot of talk of that, but there is very little actual action. And in the meantime, of course, the European Union is busy unveiling its latest 20th, I believe it is the 20th, sanctions package. By all accounts, an absolutely ragged and document, a cluster of ideas, all of which, of course, the Russians are simply going to brush aside. Anyway, my own sense is that Europe collectively has no real idea what to do. They're still comforting themselves with the idea that the Russian economy is under enormous strain, that the Russian army is losing millions of men, all of that. They're still telling themselves that all they have to do is to outwait the Russians a little longer and that the situation is in stalemate. But I suspect that deep down, even as the cities in Ukraine go dark, fewer and fewer people really believe that. They all understand that some way forward must be found, but they aren't really able to work out what it is. I will make one observation. In a year and a half, we have gone from a position where there were no contacts between the West and Russia at all. When the Biden administration, all of the major European governments, all of the major sports bodies, all the major businesses and business people boycotted, avoided Russia. I was hearing incredible stories about how there would be international meetings in global South countries and how if Russian diplomats were present, the European and Western diplomats, including the Americans, would immediately shuffle out of the room so that they wouldn't actually have any contact with the Russians, as if the Russians were carriers of the bubonic plague. Anyway, that was the situation just over a year ago. And, well, things now have completely changed. The Trump administration has regular contacts with the Russians. Putin and Trump speak often. The US and Russian militaries are talking to each other. The sports bodies are talking about restarting contacts with Russia and including Russian sportsmen in international competitions. The business people are longing to resume contacts again. But in Europe, as far as I can tell, things are as frozen as ever. It would require decisive action by some European leader to break the deadlock. And at the moment, that person is nowhere to be found. Perhaps if Keir Starmer falls next week and a new British Prime Minister emerges, Angela Rayner, perhaps that person will feel that the moment has come to start talking to the Russians again. Though I have to say, given the mood and feeling here in London and the fragility of any new Prime Minister's position, I still believe that is extremely unlikely. Anyway, there it is. So the Russians, of course, know all of this. They see all of this. They know their army is advancing. They know the situation in Ukraine itself. They see how Zelensky, as I said, is having a meltdown. I don't see why they would be in a hurry to settle anything at this time. They must be saying to themselves that from their point of view, the longer this goes on, the stronger their position gets. So why not let it drag on longer until they get all that they have asked for and are in a position to demand and get more? Just saying. Anyway, that is the situation, as far as I can see, in Europe, in the conflict in Ukraine, in terms of relations between Russia and the United States, and in Ukraine itself. Now, I have to say that over the last 24 hours, I have been getting an awful lot of extremely worrying reports and messages from all sorts of very well-informed people about the situation in between the United States and Iran. Some of these people who I've been in correspondence with are people who are very well known to viewers of these programs. Just to say, I say that they're people who have been there and who made their views known and who've appeared on channels and programs and who I know to be extremely well informed. As these were private messages, I don't want to disclose who they are, but they're also people who, to my knowledge, are extremely well informed about the mood in the United States. And my sense is that even as the Iranians are patting themselves on the back and saying that the meeting between Arakchi and Witkoff and Kushner in Oman, the meeting that was mediated by the Omani foreign minister, who shuttled from one room to the other, even as the Iranians tell themselves that that meeting went well, the Americans are in a mood of borderline fury and rage. The Iranians came with no substantive concessions. They continue to insist that they have a right to conduct enrichment, including on their territory. They are not prepared to discuss ballistic missiles. There's been some word, there's been all of these other plans about a consortium set up with the various Arab states of Rosatom, the Russian nuclear power company, participating in enrichment. These, of course, in my opinion, are all entirely proper and viable solutions to this crisis. But the United States was expecting clearly from Iran an awful lot more. They were expecting far more substantive concessions to be made, for Iran to say that it was about to give up its enrichment, or for Iran to make concessions about its ballistic missiles. I think the Americans were also shocked that the Iranians are not as frightened by the revelation from the US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, that it was indeed the United States which back in December engineered the crash of the Iranian currency, the rial. According to Bessent, they did it by creating a shortage of dollars within Iran itself. This led to the imminent collapse of an Iranian bank. The Iranian central bank had to step in to bail out that bank. That caused the Iranian central bank, forced the Iranian central bank to print or create more rials. That led to an oversupply of rials within the Iranian domestic market, which caused the rial to crash. Scott Bessent, who of course has worked with Soros, is himself an expert, I should say, in doing this sort of thing. Anyway, the Americans may have been expecting that the Iranians would be alarmed and upset by this and frightened by these revelations coming out of the United States, and they are enraged and very angry that the Iranians did not concede. And all of the talk, as I understand it in Washington, is of war again, of an attack on Iran. And in what I consider to be a very ominous development, Witkoff and Kushner, after meeting with Arakci, apparently flew to the USS Abraham Lincoln and actually toured the carrier itself and presumably spoke to the crew. So I'm afraid it does look to me as if there is now a very high probability indeed of some kind of an attack on Iran within the next few hours or days. I've read an article today in the Daily Telegraph by a former Royal Navy officer casting doubt on whether such an operation can succeed. I've also read other reports, by the way, which might suggest that there are indeed plans to place boots on the ground in Iran, even plans to try to seize the oil-rich provinces in southern Iran, in Khuzestan, and reports about an American operation in the north from the territory of either Azerbaijan or Armenia. On that issue, by the way, President Aliyev has assured the Iranians that that is not going to happen. And the Russians, who have very, very close monitoring of the situation in Armenia, are not speaking or talking about any major American build-up there. And I wonder, to be honest, how it can happen, given that Armenia has no coastline and large concentrations of American troops would have to cross the border from other countries which might not be particularly keen on such an operation taking place. But anyway, one way or the other, the situation is extremely tense. And the Iranians may think that they did very well for themselves in the diplomacy. But I think that what they need to do over the next few hours is prepare for the attack, which it is quite likely is going to come. If it does come, obviously, we will be discussing it on the Duran and on this channel. I still hope it doesn't, but at the moment, the omens look bad. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, on our various channels, Locals, Rumble and X. And please remember also to check our new Substack site. Please also remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.